This is Goku-san DBZ, and welcome back for another video. Today I'm doing my fourth, and been a few months since I did my last episode, of good and bad. We talk about both good and bad things, and I thought I'd play a little bit of music off and on in this vlog, and discuss different things, what was good, what was bad in the era. So, we'll talk a little bit about that. So here's the question. The 1990s, good or bad? That is, of course, obviously hard to really say, because we have to look at several aspects of things. And I'm trying to find a piece of instrumental music, that way no copyright issues. And, here we go. Classic gamers are going to recognize this piece. Terry's song, from the beginning of Final Fantasy III Super Nintendo, or Final Fantasy VI rather. And why not, since this is the 1990s, and that's a 90s game. So, with that said, and also the reason why I'm wearing this, classic Capcom shirt, with of course classic Street Fighter villains and good guys, along with original Mega Man. So, really, 1990s, good or bad? There's many things to look at. On the bad side, of course, in the 1990s, we had, how shall I put this? We had some pretty bad rock and metal in the 90s. We saw some really bad albums by respected groups. In the 90s, we got bad albums like Risk from great bands such as Megadeth. Luckily, it wasn't until the 2000s that we experienced Saint Anger from Metallica. But that's one example. We saw a lot of bad new metal, as they called it, in the 1990s. For instance, we got really bad music such as Limp Bizkit, Puddle of Mud, Simple Plan, Nickelback, though to be fair, some of their earlier stuff wasn't that bad from Nickelback, at least then anyways. In New Millennia, of course, they would start doing their recycling traditional average sound, which we've had for over a decade now. But on the positive side, we got some good music in the 1990s. We got upcoming bands such as Green Day, with incredible rock albums such as Dookie. We got incredible songs like Basket Case or Brain Stew, Jaded, and many other great songs from this band, which we've seen now for quite a long time. In fact, going on 21 years, I think, now as a band, or 22, around that. Quite impressive. We've seen great metal bands out of Germany, like Rammstein, from the 90s. We saw the rise of industrial metal, such as, obviously, Marilyn Manson, Orgy, which a lot of you probably have never heard of, then that rap metal crossover group calling themselves a pretty, was it Crazy Town? Yeah, kind of a stupid name, but oh well. We saw, the point is, a lot of good music, well, some good music, more bad than good, and lots of one-hit wonders. Now, I think one of the great debates is it the 80s or the 90s that will always be known as the one-hit wonder decade. That is for another video and for another debate, another day. Now, with that said, one of the greatest things to come out of the end of the 90s, Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball. Also, of course, as I wear here, another great thing to come out of the 90s was Mega Man X series of games. The reinvention and the continuation of course, regular Mega Man. We also saw the rise in 1991 of Street Fighter II, which would become probably the most beloved fighting game in history. And I thought I'd show some stuff from that time period. And this right here is, of course, Street Fighter II Championship Edition for the Sega Genesis. Definitely a true classic. But some people preferred this franchise over it. And of course that being Mortal Kombat. And then there would be the third for SNK lovers, Fatal Fury, which would give birth to the King of Fighting series, which is now released, I believe it's 15th or 16th game in the franchise, which is quite impressive. And with that said, so many great arcade games, and that helped bring arcades back from the verge of collapse. We would also see the rise of incredible comic books in the 1990s. And interesting crossovers which we would never see again, such as a 4-issue crossover miniseries, RoboCop versus the Terminator. Talk about an interesting crossover event. And even more interesting is actually one of the people who helped work on this, Frank Miller. And that name should, of course, sound familiar to any comic book fan. And next up, we shall look again at other stuff from the same time period. Of course, we saw the rise in JRPGs in the 1990s. And none bigger than, of course, Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 2 and 3 on the Super Nintendo, known as Final Fantasy 4 and 6, of course. And also in the 90s, 1997. Interestingly enough, we would see the rise of the most popular, best-selling Final Fantasy game in history, and the second best-selling game ever on the original PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII, which is considered by most to be the greatest Final Fantasy game, predominantly because of the materia system. Now me, Final Fantasy VIII is my favorite, but to each their own. Now with that said, some other stuff that was awesome about the 1990s. We would see the rise of course, Sega as a powerhouse in the 90s. And they would choose to create their mascot, which would help the Sega Genesis end up taking over and become the biggest shareholder of the game market in North America. They would help create Sonic, which would become a mascot for a generation of gamers. People such as me. We would also see the rise of many other franchises and companies to become major power players in this time frame. We would see other future mascots rise in the 90s. Also on the PlayStation, like Spyro. And the beloved Spyro series on the original PlayStation. We would also see, of course, the rise of the mascot of the original PlayStation, Crash Bandicoot, at the time produced by Naughty Dogs, which of course later on would lose the copyrights of Crash to Activision, which now they've announced, of course, they're doing a complete from the ground up HD, complete remaster of the original 3 games. Sadly, exclusive to PS4, which sucks. But definitely you can't beat classics such as Crash 2, Cortex Strikes Back. Everybody has to copy Star Wars. Incidentally, 1990s would bring a lot of controversy in the Star Wars community, with, of course, the remastering of the original Star Wars trilogy special editions, which, of course, would cause a lot of controversy when it would be altered. Han would end up looking like he shooted second rather than shooting first, and Guido shot first. Of course, we would see some not-so-good added scenes, like Jabba the Hutt in Episode 4, A New Hope, and many other added scenes, and they kept over the years, adding more and more and augmenting, which I don't know why they felt the need for it. But with that said, we would see then, of course, also at the end of the 90s, a somewhat controversial, really either you like it or you hate it type movie, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which is really either you love or hate. There's really not much middle ground on this particular film. I'm one of the few that happens to like the film. Do I mean it has issues? Yes. Dialogue being maybe the biggest issue of all. Because unlike some people, I don't despise Jar Jar Binks. But hey, to each their own, remember. Now, of other things we would see in the 1990s, we would see the rise of a rival JRPG franchise exclusive because of Nintendo having at the time exclusive rights to Squaresoft's franchise Final Fantasy. Sega had to create their own JRPG franchise to rival. And they actually succeeded with that. And it would be known as Phantasy Star. This is Phantasy Star 4 for the Sega Genesis, which is by most considered to be the Final Fantasy VI of Phantasy Star franchise. We would see the introduction of many rival fighting game franchises to try to dethrone Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, which have retained and have survived all these years. We would see other franchises rise up, like Fatal Fury, which would give birth to the Fatal Fury series. We would also see the rise of franchises like Battle Arena Toshinden, Dead or Alive, Tekken, Bloody Roar, Soul Blade, which would become Soul Calibur. We would also see the rise of other franchises, such as which got actually, of course, a few years back, a rebirth. Second Shot, Killer Instinct, which now currently is at 3 games in the franchise. Killer Instinct Gold, and the new Killer Instinct. But definitely a classic of the Super Nintendo era. Actually had their own versions of Fatalities. We would see beloved reimaginings of great franchises. The Mario Brothers games, or Super Mario Brothers, would of course give birth to Super Mario World on the Super NES, which would become probably the most beloved game in the franchise of Mario, which is incredible, and it's actually aged very well for its time. We would also see them experimenting with adding booster chips in cartridges for the Super Nintendo, such as Star Fox, which actually allowed the Super Nintendo to play an actual 3D game. That's incredible to think, the technology with a booster expansion chip inside it, because they discovered the limitations, of course, of the Super Nintendo of the 16-bit, and instead took advantage of the ability to add chips to the cartridges to able to boost the power of the console through the cartridge, which is actually an interesting concept that no other console would end up doing. Only the Super Nintendo would try this. Of course, later they would try something similar with the Sega Saturn with the 4 megabyte RAM card. We would see the rise of Juggernaut independence. Like Todd McFarlane, which would create a beloved series called Spawn, and would help found a great company that's still going strong today, Image Comics. Spawn, which the first issue would become, believe it or not, the 3rd best-selling comic book of all time. selling 3 million copies worldwide. It would only 2 comics outsold it. Issue 1 of the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man and The Death of Superman, which would end up becoming the best-selling comic book of all time. Interestingly enough, what do all these comics have in common? They all came out in the 90s. Interestingly enough. We get a special mini-series of it, which would be this and only a recently special mini-series thing would bring him back. A virtually unused, massively powerful character, which has only appeared in one video game, Marvel vs. Capcom. And his name is Onslaught. And he is a combination of Magneto and Professor Xavier in one. He also gains the power to manipulate and control the Sentinels. In the end, it would take the cooperation of many different Marvel characters, X-Men, Fantastic Four, and others, alongside working with Mr. Sinister and Apocalypse just to defeat Onslaught. That's how insanely powerful Onslaught was. Even Apocalypse paled to Onslaught in power. And that's saying something. Now, let's get on to a few other things. We would see the rise of a not-so-traditional fighting game franchise on the N64. Super Smash Bros., which is still going strong to this day, and the only reason why the Wii U has actually sold any units at all is only because of this franchise, which interestingly enough has become one of the top 3 best-selling fighting game franchises of all time, even though there's not that many games in the series. It's done insane sales numbers. We would see in the 90s what we would call, well, in 89 and onward to the mid-90s, a golden age of Disney animated films, such as Aladdin, such as Beauty and the Beast, which is now celebrating its 25th anniversary, which is insane to even say for me. But, of course, also we would see in that era greats such as, though it was a flop at the time, but now has gained one of the biggest cult statuses ever, Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. We would see also, of course, great films which I feel are very underrated, like The Hunchback of Notre Dame. We would also see an influx of other companies starting to evolve with the times, such as a small upcoming company called Blizzard, which would release a particularly, of course, has gone mainly nowadays into just PC, but at the time decided to release its second game called Dark Saga, or rather Warcraft 2 Dark Saga, which would go on to become a legendary game in the gaming community, and definitely among PC gamers, but of course it got a PS1 release as well as another game Blizzard did, the first Diablo game, which is insanely hard to find, I might add, because I've been trying for years. We would see the rise also, besides fighting games in the 90s, we would see the rise of survival horror, such as not so good ones like Clock Tower. We would see also what would become the stand, or rather the pinnacle, to really influence the mass expansion of survival horror, Resident Evil, or just Resident Evil. Director's Cut, of course, is the one I have. Not much of a difference, really, between the regular and Director's Cut. Of course, Resident Evil 2, in my view, is the best of the series, which I love, taking place in the actual city of Raccoon City. Also, this would take what Resident Evil did and take it much farther and be even creepier than Resident Evil. It would continue on elements like the angles with the cameras and everything like Resident Evil, but it would go more for psychological horror rather than jump scare type horror, such as Resident Evil or Biohazard, if you will. And that would be, of course, which would for a short time be a franchise mega hit for Konami. And from, of course, one of the greatest game designers ever, which, of course, started the Metal Gear Solid series, Kojima. He would also help start this beloved franchise, Silent Hill, which was, of course, supposed to take place, actually, interestingly enough, in my home state of West Virginia. Though it was supposed to take place in the eastern panhandle, and I live in the western part of the state. Now, we would see rises and sort of copycats to Pokemon in anime form and stuff in the nice, as well as successful somewhat games. You would have Digimon, and then you would have this series, which most people have forgotten about, Monster Ranchers, which actually was a pretty decent anime series. I've actually never played any of the 4 Monster Rancher video games, but I have heard they've talked about bringing back the Monster Rancher video game franchise. Sort of like they've revived Digimon franchise, gaming-wise, and have newer Digimon anime actually coming out. Interestingly enough, it's been revived. But Monster Ranchers hasn't quite yet been given the same treatment as Digimon. But it's actually a really interesting series, I will say. It's 3 seasons long, the anime, and as I said, I know of at least 4 games in the series, all for PlayStation and PlayStation 2. We would see the rise of course, a powerhouse, which would become unrivaled. Of course, we would see Pokemon games, like Yellow. We would also see the rise of Game Boy and then Game Boy Color. And as you can see, this is a special Pokemon Edition one of my Game Boy Color, which I still love the sound it makes. Oh, oops. Batteries are dead. My bad. Anyways, we would see also the areas such as great strategy card games come out in the 90s, like my review I did yesterday. Magic the Gathering. We would see tons and tons of Magic cards come out, which would give birth to so many series, it's insane to think about over the years how much we've seen. But, yeah, Magic has become a major thing, definitely in the community. Predominantly for the great artwork and things. And I'll show a few more things and then get ready to cut up this vlog. And there was also some great comedies, great parody movies in the 90s. Such as Austin Powers. Austin Powers, of course, Man of Mystery, and Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me. It wouldn't be until the new millennia, the third and final, sadly, installment would come out, Austin Powers in Goldmember. And of course, we would see also the rise of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, as well as Beetleborgs and VR Troopers from Saban Entertainment. We would also see the beloved animated Batman series, which of course the best Joker ever, Mark Hamill, and Kevin Conroy Batman. We would see incredible animes, like a stance for maybe the best English dub ever for an anime, Cowboy Bebop, as well as Outlaw Star, Gundam Wing, G-Gundam, Mobile Suit Gundam, Gundam the 8th MS Team, and maybe, in my eyes, besides animated Spider-Man series of the 90s, best thing that happened of the 90s, Batman Beyond. The creation of Batman Beyond, which would lead to the creation of the entire series on television, and the comic series, which is still going actually pretty strong, which I'm glad about. And I'll see you all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel, and stay tuned for my next game review, which I hope you enjoy. Well, not game review, but comic book review, which is, of course, going to be issue 1 of Bonnie Lass. As a favor to the comic book artist, which I gave my word I would review all 4 of his comic books. And each one is, of course, autographed by him. So you can get ready to look forward to this in the future. And yeah, that's a remix in the background of Force Your Way Through from Final Fantasy VIII. Great boss battle music. So I'll see you next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel. And remember, follow me Twitter.com/GokuSunDBZ as well as Google+. And tell me if you want me to do any more good or bad videos.